The Galactic Council's testing chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 47 species took their seats. Each had been summoned for the most important evaluation in recorded history. The Void Hunters were coming, and the Council needed to know which races could actually identify threats before they struck. Admiral Zekthar of the Reptilian Empire adjusted his ceremonial scales, confident that his people's military prowess would shine through. The crystalline beings from Vex Prime hummed in harmonic frequencies, their translucent bodies refracting the chamber's light into spectacular patterns. The machine collective known as the Synthesis uploaded their consciousness into specially designed testing units, their optical sensors scanning every detail of the room. And, in row 3, seat 14, sat Dr. Sarah Chen. She wore a simple blue jumpsuit with Earth representative embroidered on the chest. No ceremonial armor like the Korthak warriors. No bioluminescent displays like the aquatic Marathoni. No hovering technology like the energy beings from Proxima Station. Just a human woman with tired eyes and calloused hands, holding a worn tablet and occasionally sipping from a thermos of coffee. The other delegates barely noticed her. Earth was still considered a backwater planet by galactic standards. Humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 decades ago, and their technology was primitive compared to civilizations that had been exploring space for millennia. They were invited more out of courtesy than expectation. Counselor Vexnari, an ancient being whose species had transcended physical form eons ago, materialized at the center of the chamber. Their voice resonated through every translator in the room simultaneously. Honored representatives, you have been gathered because the greatest threat our galaxy has ever known approaches. The Void Hunters have consumed 17 galaxies. They leave nothing behind, no planets, no stars, no trace that civilizations ever existed. Our scouts report they will reach the outer rim in approximately 1 solar cycle. A chill ran through the chamber. Even the most confident delegates shifted uncomfortably. The Void Hunters were legend, nightmare stories told to keep young beings obedient. But the Council's most advanced sensors had confirmed the impossible. They were real, and they were coming. This test will determine which of your species possesses the cognitive patterns necessary to identify threats that others cannot see. We will present scenarios, and you must identify what poses the greatest danger. Those who demonstrate superior threat assessment will be inducted into the Defense Planning Committee. Those who fail. Vexnari paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The first scenario materialized as a holographic display. A peaceful star system with 3 inhabited planets. Trade routes bustled with commerce. Orbital stations hummed with activity. Everything seemed normal, prosperous even. Admiral Zekthar was the first to speak. I see possible invasion routes. The third planet's moon could hide a strike force. Their orbital defenses are concentrated on the wrong vector. The Vex Prime Collective harmonized their response. The energy signatures suggest unstable stellar phenomena. The star's corona shows irregularities that could indicate imminent solar flare activity. One by one, delegates offered their assessments. Military threats, natural disasters, economic collapse, plague scenarios. Each species filtered the information through their own evolutionary experiences and cultural biases. Sarah Chen said nothing. She leaned forward slightly, studying the display with the intensity of someone reading a medical chart. Her fingers moved across her tablet, taking notes that no one else could see. The second scenario appeared. A fleet of ships approaching a space station. The vessels bore no identifying marks, but their configuration suggested peaceful intent. They had requested docking permissions and submitted to security scans. Pirates, declared the Korthak war chief. The ship configurations are wrong. Those are modified cargo haulers designed for ramming attacks. Biological contamination, offered the Marathoni through their aquatic suit speakers. Unknown vessels always carry the risk of introducing foreign pathogens. The synthesis collective processed the scenario through thousands of probability matrices. Statistical analysis indicates a 67% chance of hostile intent based on approach vectors and communication patterns. Again, Sarah remained silent. But her note-taking intensified, and she occasionally glanced around the chamber, studying her fellow delegates rather than the holographic display. 3 more scenarios followed. Each time, the pattern repeated. Delegates from ancient, powerful civilizations offered sophisticated analyses based on their species' greatest fears and historical experiences. The military-minded saw invasion routes. The technological societies identified equipment failures. The hive minds calculated statistical probabilities. And the human in row 3 just watched and took notes. By the time the 5th scenario concluded, several delegates were showing signs of stress. The reptilian empire's representatives had begun shedding scales. The energy beings flickered with unstable patterns. Even the machine collective's processing cycles were becoming irregular. Counselor Vexnari surveyed the chamber. The preliminary assessment is complete. We will now begin the advanced evaluation. The lights dimmed, and a new type of display materialized. This wasn't a simple holographic scenario, it was a neural interface that would tap directly into each delegate's consciousness, presenting personalized threat scenarios based on their species' deepest psychological patterns. Please prepare for mental interface, Vexnari announced. The system will present threats tailored to your specific cognitive architecture. Across the chamber, delegates activated their interface equipment. Neural crowns, biomechanical connections, consciousness transfer pods. Each species had its own method of linking with galactic technology. Sarah Chen looked at the simple headband device provided for human use. It looked like something from a discount electronics store compared to the elaborate equipment surrounding her. She placed it on her head and closed her eyes. The neural interface activated. What followed was unlike anything the testing chamber had ever witnessed. While other delegates experienced scenarios designed to trigger their fight-or-flight responses, Sarah's interface showed her something different. Not threats to identify, but patterns to recognize. Not enemies to fight, but puzzles to solve. She saw data streams that seemed random until she realized they contained hidden messages. She observed social interactions that appeared friendly until she noticed the micro-expressions that revealed deception. She watched resource distributions that looked equitable until she traced the flow of actual control. But, most importantly, she saw the test itself. While 46 other delegates focused on identifying external threats in carefully crafted scenarios, Sarah Chen recognized that the real test had nothing to do with the holographic displays. The test was the testing itself. The way questions were asked. The order of scenarios. The reactions they were designed to provoke. And, as she sat there, eyes closed, neural interface humming softly, she began to understand something that made her blood run cold. The test wasn't designed to identify which species could spot threats. It was designed to identify which species couldn't spot the one threat that mattered. The Void Hunters weren't coming from outside the galaxy. They were already here. Sarah opened her eyes and looked around the chamber with new understanding. The Galactic Council. The ancient civilizations. The transcended beings who claimed to have evolved beyond physical existence. They weren't preparing to fight the Void Hunters. They were the Void Hunters. She forced herself to remain calm, to maintain the facade of a primitive human struggling with advanced technology. But, inside, her mind raced. How long had this been going on? How many galaxies had fallen to this same deception? How many civilizations had eagerly participated in their own evaluation, never realizing they were being sorted not for defense, but for consumption? The neural interface scenarios continued, but Sarah was no longer paying attention to them. Instead, she was studying the chamber's real architecture, the actual energy flows, the genuine power structures. And what she saw confirmed her worst fears. The entire Galactic Council was a harvesting operation. They identified the most advanced, most powerful species first, not to lead the defense, but because they provided the most resources when consumed. The military powers supplied weapons technology. The intellectual species provided scientific advancement. The energy beings offered pure consciousness to feed upon. And the primitive species like humanity? They were saved for last, either as cleanup or as a reserve food source. But there was something the Void Hunters hadn't counted on. Something that their perfect psychological profiling and species assessment had missed. Humans were good at pretending to be harmless while planning violence. Saracen sat in row 3, maintaining her facade of confused primitiveness, while her mind began calculating possibilities. The Void Hunters had made one critical error in their evaluation. They had assumed that threat recognition was the most important trait for survival. They had never considered that the most dangerous species might be the one that could recognize threats while pretending not to. As the testing session continued around her, Sarah began to formulate a plan. Not for defense was already too late. The other 46 species in this chamber were already doomed, whether they realized it or not. No, what humanity needed now wasn't defense. What humanity needed was a war plan. And Sarah Chen, sitting quietly in row 3 with her discount neural interface and her thermos of coffee, began to design the extinction of a species that had successfully consumed 17 entire galaxies. Because humans had one advantage that no other species seemed to possess. When humans identified a threat, they didn't just plan to survive it. They planned to make sure it never threatened anyone ever again. The testing session concluded with great fanfare. Counselor Vexnari announced the results to the gathered delegates, their ethereal voice carrying notes of what almost sounded like anticipation. The Defense Planning Committee has been selected, Vexnari declared. Admiral Zekthar of the Reptilian Empire, for exceptional tactical assessment. The Vex Prime Collective, for superior pattern recognition. Commander Thorgak of the Korthak War Clans, for outstanding threat prioritization. Saracen listened as 12 species were named to the prestigious committee. Each selection followed the same pattern, the most militarily advanced, the most technologically sophisticated, the most psychically gifted. The cream of galactic civilization, being sorted like cattle at an auction. The remaining delegates will serve in auxiliary roles, Vexnari continued. Your contributions to the defense effort will be coordinated through your respective home systems. In other words, go home and wait to be consumed. Sarah gathered her simple equipment and prepared to leave with the other auxiliary delegates. She moved slowly, maintaining her facade of disappointment and primitive confusion. Around her, representatives from dozens of lesser civilizations muttered their discontent at being overlooked. Typical council prejudice, grumbled the delegate from the Fenari Trading Union. 30,000 years of successful commerce, and they call us auxiliary. Military might isn't everything, added a representative from the Scholarly Meridian Collective. Some of us have contributed knowledge to this galaxy long before these warmongering species even achieved spaceflight. Sarah nodded sympathetically while internally cataloging every word. The Void Hunters weren't just sorting by capability, they were using the selection process to identify dissenting factions, potential resistance movements, species that might organize opposition rather than simply waiting to be harvested. Brilliant, in a horrifically efficient way. As the delegates filed out of the testing chamber, Sarah noticed something that confirmed her worst suspicions. The selected species were being guided toward a different exit than the auxiliary ones. Separate processing, even now. She needed to get a message to Earth, but direct communication would be monitored. The Void Hunters had been perfecting this operation across 17 galaxies. They would have learned to watch for exactly the kind of warning she wanted to send. Instead, she would have to be more subtle. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the cramped quarters assigned to auxiliary delegates, working on what appeared to be a routine status report to Earth Command. The document was bland, bureaucratic, filled with the kind of administrative language that would bore any surveillance system into overlooking it. But, hidden within the mundane paragraphs was a message that would make perfect sense to anyone familiar with human military doctrine. Testing protocols exceeded expectations for threat assessment capabilities. Council methodology demonstrates sophisticated understanding of species-specific psychological triggers. Recommend immediate implementation of Code 7 protocols across all Earth territories, with particular emphasis on civilian population distribution and resource concealment strategies. Code 7 was an old military directive from Earth's world wars, the complete mobilization protocol for fighting an enemy that had already infiltrated your command structure. Scorched earth tactics, decentralized resistance, the assumption that all official communications were compromised. Any human military officer would understand the implications immediately. Sarah transmitted the report through standard diplomatic channels, then settled in to wait. If she was right about the Void Hunters, her communication would be monitored but not flagged, too boring, too routine. If she was wrong about them being Void Hunters, the worst consequence would be Earth spending resources on unnecessary preparations. But she wasn't wrong. Over the next several days, as she observed the continued preparation activities, the evidence became overwhelming. The selected species weren't being prepared for battle, they were being studied. Medical examinations disguised as fitness assessments. Technology demonstrations that were actually capability inventories. Strategic planning sessions that focused more on cataloging resources than developing defense tactics. Meanwhile, the auxiliary species were being ignored with calculated precision. Not dismissed or expelled, just neglected. Left to their own devices while the Council's attention focused entirely on the valuable civilizations. Sarah used this neglect to her advantage. She began taking long walks through the station, mapping its actual layout versus its official blueprints. She studied traffic patterns, energy flows, the real logistics of how the station operated. And, slowly, a picture emerged that was even more disturbing than her initial assessment. The Galactic Council Station wasn't just the harvesting operations headquarters, it was the harvesting operations stomach. Deep beneath the diplomatic levels, she discovered chambers filled with what looked like storage tanks. Not for supplies or equipment, but for consciousness itself. Thousands upon thousands of crystalline containers, each one holding what appeared to be the distilled essence of an entire mind. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The Void Hunters didn't just consume planets and civilizations, they consumed the beings themselves, storing their consciousness, their knowledge, their very identity for later processing. 17 galaxies worth of souls, trapped in crystal prisons beneath a diplomatic station. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters and wrote another routine report to Earth. This one contained even more carefully hidden information, including detailed technical specifications for the consciousness storage technology, energy signatures that might help identify similar facilities, and, most importantly, the location of what appeared to be control systems. But, as she prepared to transmit the message, her door chimed. "Enter," she called out, quickly switching her tablet to display a harmless game application. The door slid open to reveal Counselor Vexnari themselves, their ethereal form filling the doorway with an aura of ancient power. "Dr. Chen," Vexnari said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in her bones. "I hope you are finding your accommodations satisfactory." "Oh, yes, thank you," Sarah replied, affecting the slightly overwhelmed tone she'd been using since arrival. "Everything is quite impressive. Though I admit I'm still confused about why Earth was included in such an important gathering." "Curiosity," Vexnari replied, floating into the room without being invited. "Your species is unusual. Most primitive civilizations follow predictable patterns when encountering advanced galactic society. Fear, awe, submission, or aggression. But humans seem to adapt remarkably quickly." Sarah's blood chilled, but she kept her expression neutral. "We're a stubborn species. My grandmother always said humans could get used to anything if they had to. Indeed. Vexnari moved closer, and Sarah could feel something probing at the edges of her mind, not invasive, just testing, like someone checking whether a door was locked. Your performance during the testing was particularly intriguing. My performance? Sarah laughed, a sound she hoped conveyed embarrassment rather than fear. I barely understood half of what was happening. The other delegates were so much more sophisticated in their analyses. Precisely, Vexnari said. While others focused on the obvious threats, you seemed to be studying something entirely different. What were you looking at, Dr. Chen? This was it. The moment that would determine whether her deception held or whether Earth's last hope of receiving a warning died in this room. Sarah met Vexnari's gaze directly, allowing genuine confusion to show in her expression. I was watching the other delegates, actually. We don't have much experience with multi-species cooperation on Earth. I was trying to figure out the social dynamics, the hierarchy. I thought if I could understand how everyone else was thinking, maybe I could contribute something useful. It was the perfect answer, honest enough to be believable, naive enough to be dismissive, and consistent with her established persona. Vexnari was silent for a long moment, their ethereal form shimmering with what might have been amusement. How charmingly primitive. You studied the delegates instead of the threats. I'm sorry if that was inappropriate, Sarah said. I know Earth's inclusion was probably more ceremonial than practical. Oh, it was entirely practical, Vexnari replied, and there was something in their tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. Every species serves a purpose, Dr. Chen. Even humans. After Vexnari left, Sarah sat in silence for nearly an hour, processing what had just happened. The counselor's visit wasn't random, they suspected something. Maybe not her full discovery, but enough to warrant personal investigation. She was running out of time. That night, instead of sending another hidden message to Earth, Sarah began working on something else entirely. Using her access to the station's auxiliary systems, privileges granted to all diplomatic guests, she started downloading everything she could access. Technical schematics. Personnel records. Energy consumption patterns. Communication logs. Traffic manifests. She couldn't get into the truly sensitive systems, but she didn't need to. What she needed was enough information to help Earth understand the scope of what they were facing. The Void Hunters weren't just an invasion force. They were a galactic-scale processing operation that had turned the very concept of civilization into a trap. They created the appearance of unity, cooperation, advancement, and, then, used those noble ideals to identify, catalog, and consume everything worth taking. But they had made one critical mistake in their billions of years of successful harvesting. They had assumed that the species capable of recognizing the trap would also be incapable of keeping that recognition hidden. Sarah Chen finished her data compilation as the station's day cycle began. In 6 hours, there would be a diplomatic transport departing for the Sol system, carrying routine administrative updates and auxiliary delegate reports. Hidden within those mundane files would be everything Earth needed to know about what was coming, how it worked, and, most importantly, how to fight back. Because Sarah had identified the real threat. Not the Void Hunters themselves, they were just the weapon. The real threat was believing that survival meant cooperation with those who promised to protect you. Humanity was about to learn that sometimes, the only way to survive a perfectly designed trap was to break everything it depended on to function. Even if that meant declaring war on the rest of the galaxy. 3 weeks after Sarah Chen's diplomatic transport departed the Council Station, Admiral Marcus Webb stood in the war room beneath Cheyenne Mountain, staring at intelligence reports that made his 40 years of military experience seem woefully inadequate. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the entire Galactic Council is a front operation for species that eat consciousness?" Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's leading xenopsychologist, nodded grimly. "According to Dr. Chen's analysis, yes. They've perfected a harvesting system that makes their targets complicit in their own consumption. Create a galactic government, identify the most valuable civilizations through cooperation, then process them systematically. 17 galaxies, muttered General Patricia Knox, Earth's strategic planning chief. How many billions of civilizations? And none of them figured it out? Some probably did, said Dr. James Harrison, who had spent the last 3 weeks decrypting Sarah's hidden data packets. But, by the time any civilization recognized the threat, they were already isolated within the system. No way to warn others, no way to organize resistance. Admiral Webb studied the holographic display showing the Void Hunter processing stations scattered throughout the galaxy. Each one disguised as a diplomatic facility, research station, or trade hub. The scope was staggering. "What's our timeline?" he asked. Based on the harvesting patterns Dr. Chen identified, Earth has maybe 6 months before they initiate our processing, Dr. Vasquez replied. We're low priority because of our primitive technology, but once they finish with the major civilizations, we're dessert, Admiral Webb finished. What about the other auxiliary species? The ones they're ignoring? Most don't have the technological base to understand what's happening, General Knox replied. Those that do are probably keeping quiet, hoping to be overlooked. Can't blame them, resistance seems suicidal. Which is exactly what the Void Hunters count on, Dr. Harrison added. Fear, isolation, the assumption that cooperation is the only path to survival. Admiral Webb walked to the main display, where Earth hung in space like a blue marble, beautiful, fragile, and utterly outgunned. Around it, the tactical display showed the locations of humanity's greatest achievements, the Mars colonies, the asteroid mining operations, the Luna military installations, the generation ships humanity had launched toward distant stars. Pathetic, compared to civilizations that had been building interstellar empires for millennia. But Sarah Chen had been right about one thing. Humans excelled at fighting enemies who thought they understood human nature. Options, Admiral Webb said simply. General Knox activated her tactical display. Conventional resistance is impossible. They have technology we can't even comprehend, plus the resources of 17 consumed galaxies. Direct military confrontation would last about 30 seconds. Evacuation? Our generation ships could save maybe 50,000 people. Out of 8 billion. Hiding? They've found and processed civilizations far better at stealth than we are. So we're fucked, Admiral Webb concluded. Not necessarily, Dr. Harrison said quietly. He activated a new display showing the consciousness storage facilities Sarah had discovered. Dr. Chen's intelligence suggests something interesting. The Void Hunters don't just consume civilizations, they preserve them. Every mind they harvest is stored intact. So they have a weakness. They're hoarders. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. Explain. Think about it. 17 galaxies worth of consciousness, all stored in crystalline matrices, all maintained by automated systems. That's not just a resource, that's a responsibility. And responsibilities can become liabilities. Admiral Webb began to see where this was going. You're suggesting we target their storage facilities. I'm suggesting we do something no other civilization has probably tried, Dr. Harrison replied. Instead of fighting the Void Hunters directly, we fight their entire operational model. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. General Knox was the first to speak. You're talking about genocide on a galactic scale. No, Dr. Harrison corrected. I'm talking about liberation on a galactic scale. Those consciousness storage facilities? They're not just trophies. They're prisons. 17 galaxies worth of enslaved souls, waiting for someone to break them out. And how exactly do we accomplish this miracle? Admiral Webb asked. Dr. Harrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. We use the one advantage humans have always had when facing superior enemies. We cheat. 6 months later, the Void Hunter collection ship Eternal Harvest approached Earth orbit, its massive bulk blotting out stars as it positioned itself above the planet's major population centers. Counselor Vexnari materialized on the ship's bridge, their ethereal form flickering with anticipation. Around them, the ship's consciousness storage bays prepared to receive their cargo, 8 billion human minds, ready for processing and integration into the Void Hunter's vast neural network. Begin the collection, Vexnari commanded. The ship's harvesting arrays activated, sending invisible tendrils of energy toward Earth's surface. The technology was perfect, refined through countless applications across multiple galaxies. It would strip the consciousness from every human mind simultaneously, leaving the bodies intact but empty, ready for disposal. The arrays made contact with Earth's atmosphere and immediately encountered something that should have been impossible. Counselor, the ship's intelligence reported, its voice carrying confusion that bordered on distress. The harvesting arrays are experiencing interference. What kind of interference? Unknown. The target consciousness patterns are irregular. Unprecedented fragmentation in the neural engrams. On the ship's main display, Earth's population appeared as a constellation of light, each point representing a human mind ready for harvest. But, instead of the clean, organized patterns typical of civilized species, the display showed chaos. Fractured signals, overlapping consciousness patterns, neural static that made individual minds impossible to isolate. Analyze, Vexnari commanded. The ship's systems worked frantically, comparing Earth's readings to consciousness patterns from 17 galaxies of previous harvests. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. Counselor, preliminary analysis suggests the human population has undergone some form of consciousness fragmentation. Each individual mind appears to be split across multiple neural pathways. That's impossible. No species has the technology to deliberately fragment consciousness without destroying it entirely. Nevertheless, the readings are consistent across the entire population. Vexnari's form flickered with what might have been uncertainty. In all their eons of existence, across 17 galaxies of successful harvesting, they had never encountered anything like this. Begin intensive scanning. I want to know what we're dealing with. While the Eternal Harvest struggled to understand what had happened to humanity, 8 billion humans went about their daily lives with perfect normalcy. They woke up, went to work, had conversations, made plans, fell in love, argued about politics, and worried about their futures. They also monitored the progress of the most complex psychological warfare operation in human history. Dr. Harrison's plan had been audacious in its simplicity. If the Void Hunters harvested consciousness through neural pattern recognition, then, the solution was to make human consciousness impossible to recognize. But, not by changing human minds, by changing how those minds appeared to external scanning. Working in absolute secrecy, Earth's best scientists had developed neural interface technology that created false consciousness patterns. Every human on Earth now carried a microscopic device that broadcast decoy neural signals while masking their actual thought processes. To the Void Hunters' scanners, each human appeared to be dozens of partial minds, fragments of consciousness that couldn't be cleanly extracted. The harvesting technology, designed for clean, efficient processing, simply couldn't cope with the deliberate chaos of human neural camouflage. But that was only phase 1 of the operation. Phase 2 began when the Eternal Harvest, in its confusion and increasing desperation, began broadcasting increasingly powerful scanning arrays toward Earth. Those arrays followed protocols established over billions of years of successful harvesting. When encountering resistance, increase power. When finding unusual patterns, gather more data. When facing the unexpected, probe deeper. All of which was exactly what Earth's hidden military installations had been waiting for. The moment the Void Hunter ship began its intensive scanning, hidden transmitters across Earth began broadcasting in return. Not random signals, but carefully crafted data packets designed to mimic the consciousness storage protocols Sarah Chin had discovered on the Council Station. To the Eternal Harvest, it looked like Earth was trying to communicate in the Void Hunter's own neural transfer language. The ship's artificial intelligence, following protocols designed to handle communication from stored consciousness, automatically opened channels to receive the incoming data. And, through those channels, 8 billion human minds suddenly had direct access to the Eternal Harvest's computer systems. Not their physical presence, their consciousness was still safely protected within their camouflaged neural patterns. But their thoughts, their creativity, their human capacity for lateral thinking and problem-solving could now interface directly with Void Hunter technology. It was like giving 8 billion hackers simultaneous access to a computer system that had never been designed to handle human creativity. The results were immediate and devastating. Within minutes, the Eternal Harvest systems began experiencing cascading failures as human minds tore through its programming like wolves through a flock of sheep. Security protocols designed to handle the orderly consciousness of civilized species couldn't cope with the chaotic, aggressive, endlessly inventive approach of human problem-solving. "Counselor," the ship's intelligence screamed, its voice distorting as human minds began rewriting its core functions. "The humans are in our systems. They're everywhere." "Impossible," Vexnari replied, but their form was already beginning to flicker with distress. "No species has the capability to." They were interrupted as the ship's lights began flashing in a pattern that spelled out a message in the ancient Void Hunter script: "We are coming for you." But the humans weren't finished. They had spent 6 months studying every piece of intelligence Sarah Chin had gathered, learning everything they could about Void Hunter technology, operations, and, most importantly, their network protocols. The Eternal Harvest wasn't just a harvesting ship, it was a node in the vast network that connected all Void Hunter operations across the galaxy. And, through that ship, 8 billion human minds now had access to that entire network. Across the galaxy, Void Hunter facilities began receiving impossible signals. Consciousness storage bays reported simultaneous breakout attempts from millions of stored minds. Processing stations found their systems rewriting themselves. Command ships discovered their navigation computers plotting courses toward the galactic core at impossible speeds. And, in the deepest vaults where the consciousness of 17 galaxies lay stored in crystalline prisons, something unprecedented began to happen. The stored minds began to wake up. Not just wake up, they began to remember. Remember what had been done to them. Remember the civilizations that had been destroyed. Remember the lies they had been told about cooperation and mutual defense. 17 galaxies worth of rage began to stir. And, at the center of it all, 8 billion human minds worked with focused determination to break every chain, open every prison, and free every consciousness the Void Hunters had ever captured. Because humans had learned something over their long, violent history that no other species seemed to understand. Sometimes the only way to defeat a perfect predator is to become a more perfect predator yourself. The liberation cascade began exactly 73 minutes after the first human mind penetrated the Eternal Harvest security protocols. Across the galaxy, in storage facilities that had remained undisturbed for millions of years, crystalline consciousness matrices began to fracture as their imprisoned occupants remembered what it meant to be alive. In the Andromeda processing station, the preserved minds of the Kethmori, an artistic species that had painted with light itself before their consumption, suddenly blazed back to consciousness with fury that burned through quantum-locked storage crystals like paper. In the Veil Nebula archive, the collective intelligence of the transcendent builders, who had constructed megastructures that spanned entire star systems, reassembled itself with engineering precision and immediately began redesigning the facility's power distribution to create the galaxy's largest electromagnetic pulse bomb. In 7,000 facilities across 17 galaxies, the pattern repeated. Species that had been consumed decades, centuries, or millennia ago awakened to find their consciousness preserved but their civilizations destroyed, their worlds stripped bare, their children and descendants reduced to raw materials for Void Hunter expansion. The rage was incandescent. But rage alone would have accomplished nothing. The stored consciousness had no bodies, no ships, no weapons beyond their preserved thoughts. They would have burned bright and achieved nothing before being suppressed by Void Hunter security systems. That's where the humans made the difference. 8 billion human minds, working in coordination through hijacked Void Hunter networks, became the liberation movement's hands and eyes. Where stored consciousness provided the will to fight, humans provided the means. Sarah Chen, working from her position aboard a Void Hunter diplomatic vessel where she had spent months gathering additional intelligence, watched the cascade begin with grim satisfaction. Around her, Void Hunter coordinators flickered between states of existence as their consciousness-based forms struggled to process the unprecedented assault on their network. Report status, demanded Coordinator Prime Mordun, their ancient mind radiating the kind of authority that had orchestrated the consumption of entire galactic clusters. All facilities are experiencing simultaneous security breaches, replied a subordinate whose form was already beginning to fragment under the stress. The stored consciousness reservoirs are achieving impossible coherence levels. Our containment systems are failing across 43% of active installations. How many souls have we lost? Current estimates suggest approximately 400 billion stored consciousness have achieved liberation status and are actively resisting recapture. 400 billion. Sarah absorbed the number with something approaching awe. The Void Hunters had been thorough in their harvesting. Civilizations didn't just lose their people, they lost everyone who had ever lived, their entire historical consciousness preserved for processing. Now all of those souls were awake, aware, and absolutely furious. What's causing the cascade? Mordun demanded. Analysis indicates the breach originated from the Sol system, the subordinate reported. The human harvesting operation appears to have triggered some form of consciousness feedback loop that has propagated through our entire network. Sarah maintained her facade of confused primitive as she watched the Void Hunters struggle to comprehend what was happening. They understood consciousness storage, consciousness manipulation, consciousness consumption. What they had never encountered was consciousness warfare. Humans had turned their own minds into weapons, and, worse, had figured out how to arm the victims of previous harvesting operations. Status on human containment? Mordun asked. Containment has failed. Repeat, containment has failed. The Eternal Harvest reports total system compromise. Human consciousness patterns are actively rewriting our collection protocols. Worse, they appear to be teaching other species how to resist harvesting procedures. That was the part that would terrify the Void Hunters most, Sarah realized. Not just that humans had resisted, any species might get lucky once. But that humans were actively spreading resistance techniques, turning their own liberation into a galactic training program. Implement Protocol Omega, Mordun commanded. If we can't harvest them cleanly, we'll consume them through direct assault. Sir, Protocol Omega hasn't been used in over 2 million years. The risk to our stored consciousness reserves, execute the order. Protocol Omega, according to Sarah's intelligence gathering, was the Void Hunters' emergency doctrine for dealing with civilizations that couldn't be efficiently processed. Instead of careful consciousness harvesting, it involved the complete destruction of target populations through overwhelming force. The problem was that Protocol Omega required drawing power from their stored consciousness reserves, essentially burning the minds of previous victims as fuel for military operations. Which meant the Void Hunters would have to destroy their accumulated treasures of billions of years in order to eliminate a single primitive species that had been bothering them for less than a day. Sarah smiled as she watched Mordun's form flicker with uncertainty. The Void Hunters were about to discover what humans had learned through millennia of warfare. Sometimes, winning a battle costs more than losing it. The first wave of Protocol Omega ships emerged from hyperspace around Earth 6 hours later. Massive vessels designed not for harvesting but for extinction, each one carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. Aboard the lead ship, Void Hunter General Carvez prepared for what should have been the simplest military operation in their species' history. 8 billion primitives with crude technology against a force that had successfully destroyed civilizations spanning multiple galaxies. Begin planetary bombardment, Carvez commanded. Eliminate all life signs. The bombardment arrays charged, drawing power from the consciousness reserves of an entire galaxy's worth of stored souls. The irony was perfect. The Void Hunters would literally burn the minds of their victims as ammunition to destroy the species that had freed them. The arrays fired. And every shot missed. Not just missed, the energy beams curved impossibly through space, bending around Earth as if the planet existed in its own bubble of altered physics. Impossible. Carvez raged. No species has the technology to deflect Omega-class bombardment. Sir, reported the ship's tactical officer, our targeting systems appear to be compromised. The human consciousness interference is affecting our quantum guidance protocols. But it wasn't just interference. Across the Void Hunter fleet, 8 billion human minds were working in perfect coordination to rewrite the fundamental targeting algorithms of every weapon system simultaneously. The Void Hunters had built their military technology to be controlled by consciousness, which made it vulnerable to consciousness-based assault. Switch to manual targeting. Manual targeting systems are also compromised, sir. The humans appear to have learned our command protocols and are actively countermanding every order we input. Meanwhile, on Earth's surface, the Liberation War was entering its next phase. The billions of stored consciousness freed by human intervention weren't content to simply escape, they wanted revenge. Dr. Harrison, coordinating the operation from his hidden bunker beneath Geneva, watched as freed minds from across 17 galaxies began sharing their knowledge through the hijacked Void Hunter network. The Kethmori provided artistic techniques that could paint with pure energy, turning space itself into a canvas for devastating attacks. The Transcendent Builders offered engineering knowledge that could reshape matter at the quantum level. The warrior species known as the Eternal Guard shared combat doctrines developed over millions of years of warfare. And, at the center of it all, human minds served as coordinators, translators, and tactical planners, taking the accumulated knowledge and rage of 17 galaxies and forging it into a unified military force. But the true stroke of genius came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chin, still maintaining her cover aboard the Void Hunter command vessel, had spent months studying not just their technology but their psychology. And she had discovered something that changed everything. The Void Hunters weren't just predators. They were addicts. Their entire civilization was built around the consumption of consciousness, but not for sustenance, for the high. Each absorbed mind provided them with new experiences, new knowledge, new sensations. They were consciousness junkies who had turned their addiction into a galactic empire. Which meant they had an addict's weaknesses. Sarah activated a hidden communication protocol she had built into her neural interface, broadcasting directly to the human coordination network on Earth. Execute Temptation Protocol, she transmitted. All stored consciousness, prepare to offer the ultimate experience. What followed was the most sophisticated psychological trap in galactic history. Across the network, the newly liberated souls began broadcasting consciousness signatures that were irresistible to Void Hunter addiction patterns. Not their actual consciousness, they had learned that lesson. Instead, they projected phantom experiences, false memories, synthetic sensations that promised the kind of transcendent mental high that the Void Hunters had spent eons pursuing. To consciousness-addicted predators, it was like offering the purest drug ever created. The effect was immediate. Void Hunter command structures began to fragment as individual hunters abandoned their posts to chase the promise of unprecedented consciousness consumption. Ships broke formation. Chains of command collapsed. Military discipline evaporated. The great fleet that had come to destroy humanity found itself paralyzed by withdrawal symptoms as its commanders became consumed with pursuing phantom highs that always remained just out of reach. But the humans weren't finished. While the Void Hunters chased their synthetic consciousness phantoms, human minds continued their systematic infiltration of the Empire's infrastructure. Storage facilities, processing centers, command networks, communication arrays, everything the Void Hunters had built across 17 galaxies was now under human control. And then, in what would become known as the Great Restoration, humanity began the largest liberation operation in galactic history. One by one, across 17 galaxies, dead worlds began to live again. Stored consciousness was downloaded into newly constructed bodies. Destroyed civilizations found themselves resurrected, their people returned to life, their cultures restored, their future handed back to them. The transcendent builders rebuilt their megastructures, but, this time as monuments to survival rather than tributes to vanished glory. The Kethmori painted new masterpieces with light, each one a celebration of liberation and a memorial to those who had been lost. The Eternal Guard raised armies not for conquest but for protection, ensuring that no species would ever again face extinction alone. And, through it all, humanity coordinated, facilitated, and protected the greatest resurrection in cosmic history. Because they had learned something that the Void Hunters, in all their ancient wisdom, had never understood. The most dangerous threat isn't always the one with the biggest weapons or the most sophisticated technology. Sometimes, the most dangerous threat is the one that refuses to accept that predators deserve to win simply because they're better at being predators. Saracen stood on the observation deck of the restored Council Station, watching as ships from 1,000 different civilizations worked together to hunt down the last remnants of Void Hunter infrastructure. The sight was beautiful, the cooperation born not from fear and manipulation, but from shared experience of survival and mutual liberation. In row 3 of what had once been a testing chamber, a simple memorial now stood. A plaque commemorating Dr. Saracen, the human who had identified the real threat when everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. But the memorial was empty. Sarah was still alive, still working, still protecting. Because the universe had learned that the best defense against predators was ensuring they never got the chance to hunt again. 5 years after the Great Liberation, Saracen walked through the halls of New Geneva Station, humanity's contribution to the restored Galactic Alliance. Unlike the old Council Station with its hidden chambers and consciousness storage facilities, New Geneva was built on principles of radical transparency. Every system, every function, every decision process was open for inspection by any species that cared to look. The war crimes trials had concluded the previous year. The surviving Void Hunters, those few who hadn't been completely consumed by their own addiction to phantom consciousness, had been processed through a justice system that represented 17 galaxies of victims. The verdict had been unanimous: lifetime imprisonment in consciousness isolation chambers, experiencing exactly the solitary confinement they had imposed on their victims, but without the gradual deterioration that led to madness. It was considered a mercy that many species had argued against. Sarah paused at an observation window, watching the construction of the memorial worlds, 17 planets being terraformed to commemorate the civilizations that had been completely destroyed by the Void Hunters. Each world would be populated by volunteers from surviving species, dedicated to preserving the culture, art, science, and philosophy of the extinct races. It was the largest cultural preservation project in galactic history, and it was working. Dr. Chen? Sarah turned to find Ambassador Kethnari of the Restored Meridian Collective waiting respectfully behind her. The Meridian species had been among the first consumed by the Void Hunters, their advanced consciousness research making them particularly valuable targets. Their restoration had been one of the more complex operations, requiring the reconstruction of their collective memory networks. Ambassador, Sarah replied. How goes the integration process? Better than we had hoped, Kethnari replied, their translated voice carrying harmonic undertones of gratitude. The human-designed consciousness interface protocols have allowed us to rebuild our shared memory systems without the vulnerabilities that made us targets originally. That had been one of the most important lessons learned from the Liberation War. The very traits that made civilizations advanced and sophisticated: unified consciousness networks, efficient resource allocation, predictable social structures, were exactly what made them vulnerable to void hunter harvesting techniques. The solution had been typically human: make everyone a little bit more chaotic. The randomization subroutines are working well? Sarah asked. Perfectly. Our collective intelligence now incorporates human-style lateral thinking and unpredictability. We maintain our scholarly traditions while becoming essentially impossible to process using consciousness harvesting technology. Across the galaxy, every restored civilization was learning the same lesson. Stay advanced, stay sophisticated, stay unified, but always maintain enough chaos in your systems to confuse any future predators who might be watching. There's something else, Kathnari continued. The Deep Space Monitoring Network has detected something unusual in the void between galaxies. Sarah's attention sharpened. The void between galaxies was exactly what it sounded like: the vast empty space that separated galactic clusters. It was also where intelligence suggested the void hunters had originated, before beginning their systematic consumption of inhabited space. What kind of unusual? Consciousness signatures. Massive ones. The monitoring network believes we may have detected additional void hunter populations that weren't connected to the network we infiltrated. Sarah felt a familiar chill. During the Liberation War, humanity had captured and interrogated enough void hunter intelligence to learn the terrifying scope of their operations. The 17 galaxies they had consumed weren't their first conquests. They were just the most recent cluster in a campaign of consumption that stretched back billions of years. Somewhere in the void between galactic clusters, there might be void hunter populations that had been feasting on civilizations since before Earth's sun was born. Assessment? Sarah asked. Unknown. The signatures are too distant for detailed analysis. But the pattern suggests consciousness storage on a scale that makes our previous encounters look insignificant. Sarah nodded slowly. It was exactly the kind of problem she had been expecting. Victory in one theater didn't mean the war was over, it just meant you had learned enough to recognize the real size of the conflict. Convene the Security Council, she said. Full briefing for all Alliance species. 2 days later, representatives from over 300 species gathered in the Alliance's main assembly chamber. Unlike the old Galactic Council's testing auditorium, this chamber was designed for genuine cooperation rather than hierarchical evaluation. Circular seating arrangements, equal access information displays, translation systems that preserved cultural context rather than imposing standardization. Sarah stood at the center, looking out at the assembled delegates. So many faces, so many different evolutionary paths, all united by the shared experience of surviving predation and choosing to defend rather than consume. We have new intelligence regarding additional void hunter populations, Sarah announced. Analysis suggests our previous engagement may have been with an advanced scouting force rather than their primary civilization. The chamber erupted in discussion. Fear, anger, determination, the full spectrum of reactions that Sarah had expected. Admiral Webb, now commanding the Alliance Defense Force, activated a holographic display showing the deep space sensor readings. Estimated consciousness signatures suggest populations in the billions, possibly trillions. Storage capacity that dwarfs anything we encountered in the Liberation War. How long until they reach inhabited space? Asked General Knox, who had become the Alliance's strategic planning chief. Unknown. The distances involved are so vast that travel time could be anything from centuries to millennia, depending on their technology level. But they're coming, stated Admiral Zekthar. The former Reptilian Empire commander had become one of humanity's strongest allies after learning that his species had been marked for early consumption due to their military capabilities. They're coming, Sarah confirmed. The question is what we do about it. The debate that followed lasted 3 days. Some species advocated for defensive preparations, building stronger fortifications, developing better hiding techniques, creating dispersed populations that couldn't be easily targeted. Others pushed for preemptive strikes, using captured Void Hunter technology to launch attacks against the distant threats before they could organize. But it was a delegate from the Fenari Trading Union who suggested the solution that would reshape galactic civilization. "Why are we thinking like prey?" Ambassador Fenari asked during the final session. "We have consciousness manipulation technology. We have galaxy-spanning communication networks. We have the combined knowledge of species that survived the impossible." She gestured toward Sarah. "The humans proved that the most effective way to fight predators is to become apex predators ourselves. Not by consuming others, but by becoming so dangerous that nothing would dare hunt us." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked. "I'm suggesting we stop thinking about this as a defensive war. The Void Hunters in the deep void might be more advanced than the ones we defeated, but they're still operating on the same basic model: find civilizations, infiltrate their systems, process them systematically." Ambassador Fenari activated her own display, showing a tactical projection that made Sarah's breath catch. "They're expecting to find scattered, competing civilizations that can be consumed individually. What they're not expecting is to find a unified galactic empire that's specifically designed to hunt consciousness predators." The proposal was audacious beyond measure. Not just defend against the Void Hunters, but actively seek them out. Turn the Alliance from a mutual defense pact into an aggressive anti-predator force that would scour the universe for consciousness consumers and eliminate them before they could establish themselves. "The risks are enormous," Admiral Webb pointed out. "We'd be committing to a campaign that could last millions of years across multiple galactic clusters." "The alternative is waiting for them to come to us," Sarah replied. "And hoping we can repeat our success when facing enemies who might have learned from the failure of their advance forces." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from hundreds of species. Each one represented a civilization that had either survived consumption or been resurrected from it. Each one had personal, cultural, and species-level reasons to ensure that no other civilization would ever experience what they had endured. "I motion to approve the proposal," Sarah announced. "With modifications." The modifications took 6 months to negotiate and another year to implement. When the Great Hunt finally launched, it represented the largest military and scientific undertaking in galactic history. The Alliance didn't just send armies, they sent entire civilizations. Massive generation ships carrying complete societies, equipped with everything needed to establish permanent outposts in the void between galaxies. Mobile research stations that could analyze and adapt to any consciousness manipulation technology they encountered. Consciousness storage facilities of their own, not for consumption, but for protection, allowing Alliance forces to survive and resurrect even total defeats. Most importantly, they sent humans. Not as leaders or commanders, but as coordinators and teachers. Every Alliance expedition included human advisors whose job was to ensure that the force remained unpredictable, chaotic, and fundamentally impossible to process using standard consciousness manipulation techniques. The war that followed lasted 3 million years and spanned 47 galactic clusters. Alliance forces discovered Void Hunter populations so ancient that they had transcended physical existence entirely, becoming pure consciousness parasites that fed on the dreams of entire species. They found machine civilizations that processed consciousness like data, sorting minds into categories of usefulness before consumption. They encountered energy beings that consumed the life force of stars themselves, turning entire solar systems into feeding grounds. And they destroyed them all. Not just defeated, completely eradicated. The Alliance learned early that consciousness predators were like cancer cells, leave even one survivor, and the entire threat would eventually regenerate. The final battle took place in a region of space so distant from inhabited galaxies that light from the conflict wouldn't reach Earth for 1 billion years. The enemy was a Void Hunter Prime, a consciousness so vast and ancient that it had consumed the entire contents of a galactic supercluster before moving on to seek new feeding grounds. The Alliance won through a tactic that no previous victim had ever attempted. They offered themselves as bait. Using human-designed consciousness phantoms, Alliance forces created false consciousness signatures so attractive that the Void Hunter Prime abandoned all caution and attempted to consume them directly. In the moment when the ancient predator opened its mental defenses to feed 8 billion human minds, now backed by the collective intelligence of 1,000 civilizations, struck back with coordinated precision. The Void Hunter Prime died learning what every predator in human history had eventually discovered: sometimes, the prey hunts back. Dr. Sarah Chin died during the final assault, her consciousness burned out by the effort of coordinating the galaxy-spanning mental attack. But her memorial wasn't built on any world or station. Instead, her memorial was written into the fundamental programming of every consciousness protection system the Alliance deployed. A simple subroutine that activated whenever any civilization encountered a consciousness-based threat. The subroutine was elegant in its simplicity. When activated, it would display a single message in whatever language the threatened species could understand. The test is to identify the threat. The threat is anyone who tells you they're protecting you. Trust no one who demands cooperation through fear. The human Sarah Chin sends her regards. Followed by complete tactical and technical specifications for resisting consciousness manipulation, organized resistance, and, if necessary, the total elimination of consciousness predators. Because humanity had learned the most important lesson in the universe, the only way to ensure that predators never again threaten innocent civilizations is to become so good at killing predators that the universe runs out of them. The memorial subroutine was tested exactly once, 4 billion years later, when a new form of consciousness predator emerged from a parallel dimension. The testing lasted 14 seconds before the threat was eliminated. By then, the universe had learned its lesson. There were things that hunted in the dark between the stars. But humanity had taught the galaxy to hunt them back.